Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. You can pretend this is a wedding. So my name is Len Friedman. I am the president of the Global Biological Standards Institute. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd just like to welcome all of you, truly, to our workshop on antibody validation standards. You are all here tonight because you have a strong interest in promoting reproducibility in basic research and by improving the quality and consistency of research antibodies. As you know, this workshop is intended to be participatory and groundbreaking, we hope. Our primary goal is to develop a consensus on antibody validation and recommendations on their widespread adoption. We look forward tomorrow morning to your contributions throughout the day tomorrow and on Tuesday. Okay, so I just want everybody to know that that's it for the formal introductions tonight. Tomorrow I will certainly acknowledge our very generous sponsors and charge the goals of this meeting, but I will leave that till tomorrow morning. Tonight, I want to introduce our very special keynote speaker, David McAdams. David came to our attention last year when he reached out actually to David Rim, one of our steering committee members for this meeting, and he had some initial thoughts on how to address the irreproducibility crisis. And it became very clear through a series of email exchanges and telephone calls between David and me that he would be a terrific breath of fresh air to kick off this meeting. David is an economics professor at Duke University, and his expertise is in the area of economic theory, and in particular in game theory, which I'm only learning by reading David's book, which I urge you to all purchase, available on Amazon. And here it is. Game changer. He is, in addition to being an accomplished theorist, David really has this, and you'll see this tonight in his talk, a rare ability to translate theory into practice. This book, which came out in 2014, Game Changer, A Game Theory, and the Art of Transforming Strategic Solutions, is remarkable not just for its clarity, and believe me, I am as far away from economic theory as you can possibly get, but David really lays out the central ideas of game theory in a really rich and fascinating set of examples and applications. I think he'll draw on that tonight in his talk. And that comes from the world of business, medicine, finance, military history, crime, sports, and everything you can imagine in between. And given that we fully intend this workshop, this Asilomar Antibodies workshop, to be a game changer for research antibodies, it's only appropriate that we hear from the man himself. So I'm really looking forward to it. Since writing Game Changer, David has kept a very busy, extraordinarily set of diverse, important strategic challenges that he has been pursuing. It's kind of hard to keep track of, at least in my simple mind, all the things that he engages in a really deep and meaningful way. For example, he recently gave a lecture at the CDC on how to reverse the rise of antibiotic resistance, and a lecture at the University of Nebraska on how to preserve the effectiveness of genetically modified corn. Not to mention a number of op-ed pieces which you could easily Google tonight on a matter of all kinds of topics, such as, how to rescue hostages from Islamic State, or why NFL coaches are, quote, too chicken for their own good. So from Islamic State to the National Football League. So no matter what, I guess that bombed. No matter what the topic, invariably, so to speak, a couple of glasses of wine here. No matter what the topics, invariably something valuable has emerged from our own discussions with David, and you'll in a few minutes you will hear that as well. David looks at the problems of a topic as complicated as research antibodies that we know so well, he's going to look at it in a slightly different way and generate creative ideas through revealing connections to both strategic challenges in the business world and how they've been solved. And I think that that kind of unique sort of lessons learned from other industries can really inform how we can approach this incredibly complicated topic. So I can't think of a better way to open this conference and set the stage for us to change the game of antibody validation than to hear from, sorry David, the game changer himself, David McAdams.
Thank you, Lynn. I think I'm blushing a little bit right now. And I guess as the first speaker, although this is not officially the conference yet, I guess I need to thank you and the organizers for putting this together. I've been looking forward to this conference for months now, and what we might be able to accomplish, getting all of the different types of players together. And thank you for inviting me and giving me this chance to talk with you. So I want to start by amplifying the introduction, because I think it's valuable for you to know who I am and sort of how in the world I came to be here at this conference. Because I'm not a scientist like you guys. But so let me tell you a little bit about myself to start. So I'm what's referred to as an economic theorist. Okay, and as such, I have a wide-ranging interests. Okay, so the principles of economics can be applied to all sorts of diverse phenomena. Okay, so theorists think about lots of things. So I can go from my early work on kind of the foundations of game theory, like proving mathematically that equilibria exist, to now, my most exciting work, I think the best work of my career, is on antibiotic resistance. Okay, and so developing the economic theory of medicine, how we treat patients. But I want to emphasize I'm not an expert in biochemistry, and you'll discover that in this talk as I attempt to talk about immunohistochemistry or whatever, and I say something really stupid, like he doesn't know an antigen from antibody, so my apologies ahead of time. But so I have these wide-ranging research interests, but actually what drew me here is not actually my research. It actually comes more from my teaching experience. And so I have an MBA class. I have about 150, 200 students every year. And what we do in this class is we don't teach the math of game theory, but we teach what I call the art of game theory. So how do you take a complex strategic ecosystem, that's the phrase I use, and how do you sort of diagnose the cause of the strategic challenge? And then how do you use the ideas in game theory to kind of brainstorm iterative potential solutions? Okay, so and I've been teaching this class for well over 10 years now, and I've mentored like hundreds of teams through this process, and I've seen every conceivable application, and it's been really fun. And that actually induced me to start trying to do it myself. And so I wrote that book in 2012 and learned about 10 to 20 applications, and since then I've continued doing it. And basically I've been emboldened to think about things that I have no right to think about. Okay, so I'm not an expert in political science, and I certainly don't know anything about the budget. Okay, but nonetheless, 2 days before they reached a deal to avoid that debt ceiling crisis, I published a New York Times op-ed on how the politicians could change the game and avoid that sort of crisis in the future. So and that's the same spirit in which I emailed David. There's no reason why I should be emailing one of the world's leading experts on antibodies. But I read a story, and maybe it was in the New York Times, maybe it was Nature News, I'm not sure. But it was talking about his sort of evangelical effort to get people to improve their antibody use. And so I wrote him an email, and I made a couple connections. I think maybe the example I used was consumer safety as my analogy, and that got us talking. And that's ultimately why I'm here. Again, hopefully as a breath of fresh air for you. But what I think I definitely bring is a different perspective. I'm definitely different than you. So maybe there's some things I can say that'll spark some conversations we wouldn't have otherwise had. Okay? So in addition to having an ongoing conversation with GBSI and David, in case anyone's interested, I do have actually a deeper engagement I'm involved in with the Structural Genomics Consortium, especially around chemical probes. So we've recently launched this thing called the Chemical Probes Portal. It's an example of what I'm going to refer to as a decision aid in the talk. And it's interesting about chemical probes, these small molecules, is they do raise a lot of the same strategic issues as arise in antibodies. It's just they're simple, okay, in many ways. Okay, so anyway, so that's enough about me. What's my plan for this talk? So my goal here is to try to be as useful as I can be to you. Okay, and so thinking about how that could work, I identified sort of two things I could try to do in this talk. First of all, I'm going to try to give you a bit of a primer on how economists think about standards. Okay, because standards, and more broadly, the coordination problem, okay, this is one of the core topics of economic theory. Okay, so we have a lot of experience thinking about standards in a wide variety of contexts. You know, what makes for a successful standard? When do you want a standard? When should you not have a standard? What are the types of standards? Okay, so I'm going to try to give you kind of a coherent conceptual framework for thinking about that, and hopefully that'll be useful to kind of enrich the conversations we have. I'm also going to provide some examples outside of science. Okay, and I've chosen these examples because it feels to me like there's a strategic aspect of each of these examples that mirrors something that may be going on around antibodies. Okay, so, and once I finish that, I'm then going to take my own stab at sharing some of my own thoughts. I'm trying to apply the concepts to the different aspects that we're going to be discussing in the various panels at the conference. Okay, so that's sort of my goal, what I'm hoping to do. And so I'll begin by, okay, well, can you hear me over here? Oh. All right, for everyone watching in the future, you didn't miss much. All right, so let me start with, because you know this is going to be a viral hit, right? About 5 people are going to watch that thing, and most of them will be my mom. Okay, so anyway, hi mom. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to start with sort of the game theory background, and hopefully you'll see the relevance of these concepts as we then try to apply them later. Okay, so first of all, what am I talking about as a game? Okay, so the concept of game is this extraordinarily general concept. It refers to any situation where there's more than one decision maker, okay, and their decisions impact each other. So we are literally playing a game right now. I am talking, you are not talking. That's an equilibrium of our game. Another equilibrium would be you're all talking to each other and I'm talking and no one hears me. That would be another equilibrium, right? So that's a game, and game theory is a study of games. Right, so we're surrounded by games in every aspect of our life, okay? It's not just about competition, for example, and especially we're playing games when we're in the lab. Okay, so there's games going on around antibodies. And in particular, we're going to focus tonight on research antibody use and validation. Okay, and there are many players, so decision makers are called players here, but I'm going to focus on 3 groups right now. One is the producers who make the antibodies. We have the scientists who use them, and then we have the journals who publish the findings. And many other players who are doing things that impact the options available to them and their various incentives. Okay? And what are we talking about? So wherever there's a decision, there's a game. Okay, so it's helpful to think carefully about what are the relevant decisions that are being made. So for instance, in the case of scientists, a fundamental decision is how they design their experiment. So which antibody are they going to use? What company are they going to get it from? Okay. Once they have the antibody, what do they do to validate its performance in their own experimental context? After they're done, what do they report about what they did? And more generally, what information do they share about what they may have learned during the process? Okay, so those are some of the key decisions they make. Producers similarly decide what antibodies to sell in their catalog. For each antibody, they decide how to validate it. There's different intensities of validation that are possible. There's different applications you could validate for. Okay, so that's a complex decision. They may make many other choices too, like how do they identify their antibodies, and more broadly, what information are they sharing about their products. And then we have journals, of course, who make a fundamentally important decision, which is which papers to accept. Okay, and the process that they use to go about reviewing papers, including any submission requirements. Okay, so those are some key decisions that journals make. All right. And there are many other players, everything from funders to regulators to scientific organizations and the august body that brought us here. Okay, so and these players and others are actively trying to change the game. Okay, and one way that they can do that is by setting standards. Okay, but one thing I think is important to understand from the get-go is that not all standards are created equally. Okay, there's different types of standards. There's different reasons to have standards. So let's start by talking about 3 basic reasons for a standard. Now, of course, most real standards may actually touch on more than one of these points, but I find it helpful to break it down that there are these 3 distinct reasons why standards can be beneficial. The first is they can help people make better choices. Okay, they can empower people to avoid mistakes. Okay? Second is they can achieve coordination. So what that means is there might be certain situations where we all benefit if we do the same thing. It's not just making a good choice, but we might benefit by doing things similarly. And we'll talk a lot about why there might be coordination benefits here later. But the third one is to change behavior. Okay, so maybe people's choices are based on a perverse incentive, something that benefits them but doesn't benefit the community at large. And a standard can create a new incentive. Okay? So we'll see examples of these. But let's just talk through each of them a little bit at a kind of abstract level with little stick figures. Okay? So this first example, a standard that helps you make better choices. So the context we're imagining is one where, let's say you're making a choice. Okay? But the key thing is that you internalize the consequences of your choice. Okay, so everyone wants to make a good choice, but some people may not be equipped to do so. They may just make a bad choice. Okay? What does a standard do? So like, I always forget how long to cook the pasta. Thank God the back of the box has a recipe, okay? 10 minutes, it's gonna work. All right, so a standard can be like a recipe. Okay? It can tell you what to do. It can give you a kind of a recommended choice. Okay, and that's useful because it helps everyone avoid mistakes. Yeah, that's the first basic type of standard, the first reason to have standard. The second one is to achieve coordination. So the context here that we're imagining is that there's some sort of social benefit from coordination. And again, I'll talk more about what I mean later. But the second key feature is that if everyone else is behaving a certain way, then so do you. Okay, so when that's true, it's good for everyone involved to coordinate. Okay, so what I've shown here in this picture is a situation where there's 2 options and the community is divided in 2. Okay? Half are choosing 1, half are choosing 2. Now, that means that none of them enjoys the coordination benefits. Okay? What standards can do in this sort of setting is to create what we refer to as a focal point or a focal choice. Okay, so if someone announces, hey, we're going to go with choice 1, well, everyone hears that, and then they all are going to coordinate on choice 1. And so an example from everyday life for that one might be the stoplight. Okay? Everyone knows red means stop, green means go. Right? But it could have been any colors, right? There's no reason it had to be those. But somebody picked red and green, and now the whole world uses red and green. Okay, so that's an example where we benefit from coordinating. Okay? Third is that we might want to change behavior. Okay, as I say abstractly here, incentivize prosocial behavior. Okay, so an example in the antibody case might be sharing the results of your self-validation study. But the general context here is that you have a choice to make. You can do something that benefits others or not. And if your personal incentive is not to do that thing, okay, it's in your own interest not to help everybody. But imagine a world where no one helps anybody. Okay? In game theory, we call this game the prisoner's dilemma. So if you've ever learned that, that's what I'm talking about right now. Everyone suffers when no one does what's in the common good. Okay? In this context, a standard can change the game by changing your incentives. Okay, so either by creating a punishment if you do the selfish thing, or creating a reward if you do the sort of selfless thing. So 2 examples, again, from everyday life, like a speed limit. Yes, you could speed, but you're going to get caught once in a while, and we'll give you a financial penalty. Okay? Or we could reward good behavior. So, hey, if you hold the door open, I'll say thank you and I'll smile. Okay, so that's like a reward. That's also changing your behavior. Or if we simply announce the customary behavior is always validated. Even if there was no punishment mechanism, or just knowing that's what you're supposed to do, might actually change some behavior. Okay, so, but broadly speaking, we're changing incentives here. Okay, so those are the 3 reasons to have a standard, and it's really valuable to figure out what the reasons you're having a standard for, because depending on the reason, you're going to need to adopt different sets of policies to support the standard. Okay, so consider the case of a standard whose purpose is to empower us to make better choices. Okay, so clearly we need to promote the standard. Okay, so everyone knows that the recipe needs to be on the back of the box, right? But should there be like a pasta police that comes after me if I don't cook it for 10 minutes? Right? Think about it. Like, what if somebody knew that 10 minutes was the customary length of time, but they wanted to do something else? What if someone knew that the validation standard was to do X, Y, and Z, but they actually thought, I can do better than that? Do we want to force people to follow a standard? No. If the standard is meant to help people make better choices, we are actually better off not compelling people to follow the standard. It's enough and it's fully sufficient to inform them of the standard, to educate them of it. Okay? On the other hand, if it's a different purpose, you may actually need to get people to follow the standard. So I'll go to the other extreme. So if we're trying to stop people from being naughty, okay, so if there's something they're trying to get away with, okay, even after we've established the standard, we need to continually provide incentives, either through a reward or, again, a sanction. Okay, so the standard won't maintain itself in that third case. And I'll go to the middle case where there's coordination problem, where the coordination is the thing. Once you've gotten people to adopt the standard, you don't need to keep making an effort to keep them on it, because there's a coordination benefit. So if everyone else is doing it, you have an incentive to do it. And again, in that type of situation, if someone came along and said, well, I know that everyone does it this way, but I want to do it different. We actually don't want to dissuade that person, because they probably have a really good reason for doing what they're trying to do. So again, you only want to compel maintenance of the standard when you're going after changing behavior. Now, there's one last thing on this slide, which has to do with whether it's a brand new standard or a pre-existing standard. So just to explain, on the second row there, we're describing a situation where there's currently chaos. So everyone's like, please give us a standard. Any standard will do. People are crashing at all the intersections. Pick any color. Okay? So that's what that is. But more common is the one where there's already kind of a way that things get done. People already implicitly, even though no one has ever announced it's the standard, it's just the way it is. Okay? And so you can think about that as the status quo standard. And so getting them to switch to the new standard can be a very painful process. So that little check mark there is encapsulating a lot of pain and suffering that is associated with the transition. Okay? All right, so I think I've said enough on this slide. So what have I done? So far, I've introduced what a game is, talked about the 3 basic purposes of standards, and now I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about the different types of standards. And there's 2 distinctions that I think are helpful here. I've made up those words. You'll never read those anywhere else. They're not important, but the idea is behind them. The first distinction is between what I call an unconditional standard and a conditional standard. Okay, so examples from everyday life. When you shake hands, okay, I'm right-handed and I always shake with my right, but I'm pretty sure my left-handed friends also shake with their right. Okay, no matter who you are, what the context, you shake with your right hand. Okay? By contrast, the stoplight, it tells you to stop when the traffic is moving. But once that traffic stops, it tells you to go. So what the standard tells you to do depends on the circumstances. Okay, so a conditional standard is one where the prescribed behavior depends on what's going on. All right, that's the first distinction. The second one is between what I call a fixed standard and you could call it a dynamic standard, but I call it an accumulative standard to emphasize it builds on itself. So a fixed standard might be like what side of the road you drive on, right? Now that's a conditional standard, right? Because which side it is depends on what country you're in, all right? But I'm pretty sure that that map isn't changing anytime soon, okay? Because the costs associated with change, there's actually a whole book, believe it or not, written on this. It explains the history of every single country, and anyway, I won't go into that. But just trust me when I tell you, it's not just complicated. It would be an extraordinarily costly process to change the side of the road we drive on. Okay, and so that's a fixed standard. And the thing about fixed standards, why it's such an important concept, is that there's a thing called the standards trap. Okay, you get stuck in a standard. So even if we get together, and say, hey, this would be a wonderful standard, let's do this, and it's the best thing we can do today, circumstances may change. Like a new technology comes along, and we're still stuck in the old standard. Okay, so you need to be really careful when you're designing a standard. And you can solve the standards trap by designing an accumulative standard. So an example from the World Wide Web Consortium, they recently upgraded HTML4 to HTML5. And by design, these standards are backward compatible, right? So if I wrote a website using HTML4, it's still going to work, right? It's just that if I want to take advantage of the new features, make my website run better, I'll then rewrite it using HTML5. Okay, so that's the basic idea. All right. So those are the core concepts to guide discussion. And now I'm just going to give 3 examples from outside of science that, again, I think illustrate an issue that may be important in the antibody context. They're professional certifications, food quality designations, and social network interoperability. Okay, so first on the professional certifications. So here's this guy, Sajid Ali, and he's explaining how his life was changed by his Microsoft Certified Professional Certificate. All right, and because it allowed him to get interviews and get a job. Now, the effect of a professional certificate like this may seem kind of obvious to us, right? But I think it's actually helpful to dig into it a little bit and ask, what exactly is this certificate program doing? How exactly is it changing the game that Sajid was playing? Okay, and it actually does 2 very different things at the same time. The first is it empowers the hiring firm, or how do I say it? It allows the hiring firm to identify qualified workers. Okay, so this is a standard that improves the decision of the hiring firm. Okay, by allowing Sajid to stand out from the crowd. It also incentivizes workers like him to undergo the training and get certified. Okay, so this standard, this certification standard, is an empowering standard. It makes better decisions for the hiring firm, but it's an incentivizing standard. It changes the behavior from the point of view of the workers. Okay, so it's doing those 2 things at the same time for different groups. All right, so that's all I have to say on that. You can probably imagine the connections that are going to be to antibodies, but I'm not going to talk about the connections now. Just presenting the examples, and hopefully these examples can be like shorthand for some ideas. Okay, so the second one is organic food. It turns out that if you're a farmer, you can certify your farm as organic. You submit an application which is customized. Every farm has a unique application called an organic system plan. And as long as it meets the requirements of the system, they then send an inspector to make sure you didn't tell any lies, okay, on your application. And then you're certified, and your stuff is an organic ingredient. All right? Then the folks who make food out of those ingredients have 3 levels they can choose from. They can be 100% organic, which is self-explanatory, or they can call themselves organic if it's at least 95% organic ingredients, or they can call themselves made with organic ingredients with a similar way, if they validate their antibodies in a similar way, okay, for similar experiments. That's sort of what I'm getting at. I think the answer is likely yes. Okay, and here are a few sources of potential sources of coordination benefits. I know I have a very different way of talking because I use all this economic jargon. Hopefully, you're catching the drift, okay? So what I mean by coordination benefit, for example. So one source of coordination benefit is that the papers that use a customary method will tend to have more impact, okay? And that's not totally obvious. Yes, if your study is reproducible, you're going to have more impact. But we don't need a standard to have reproducible science. Every paper could just be extremely explicit about what they did themselves. They all do it different, okay? That could be. But what if the scientists doing similar work use similar methods? It would then be easier for the reader to understand what they're doing and easier for them to reproduce it. Okay, so that's how there could be a coordination benefit. Okay. Second, if we did actually have some sort of incentive problem, if I was wrong, and we do need to check on people, then having a standard makes it really easy to spot kind of deviant behavior. Okay, because they're behaving differently, we can devote extra resources to checking out what they're doing and making sure it's for a good reason. Third, there would likely be more information sharing. Okay, in particular, so imagine that we have a research community, sort of scientists doing kind of similar work, okay? And imagine first if everyone uses the same method to validate their antibodies. If someone comes along with a study that shows how to do it better, hey, that paper is going to have a big impact. A lot of people are going to cite it. Okay, so journals will be wanting to publish that paper. Okay? On the other hand, if that research community is highly fragmented, and maybe they have like 10 different ways of validating the antibody, if you figure out a way to make one of those 10 ways better, that's great, but guess what? It's going to get 1/10 of the citations. So journals will have much less incentive to publish any paper when it's fragmented like that. So there can be more information sharing, for example, through more journal space, potentially. And more journal space is just one example of a broader concept that I refer to as supportive infrastructure. So if there is a standard way of doing things, other people make investments that improve kind of your ability to do that, or that lower the cost of doing that. So one way that can work is through so-called economies of scale. Like if there's some costly machine that's needed, if many people use the machine, you can spread the cost, for example. Or another, I think, really important one is you get better customer service. If you're a producer and you're selling an antibody and people are validating it in 10 different ways, well, and then they call you for help when it doesn't work. Oh, you got to keep track of 10 different ways? It'd be much easier if there was one way. Then you could actually send out a little pamphlet explaining it, and your phone reps are all trained, and okay, he's shaking his head. But anyway, but the idea is that there could be benefits to having a standard way of doing things. On the other hand, there could also be some coordination harms. So there are some ways in which setting a standard could make us worse off than if we had done nothing at all. Okay, so we definitely need to bear in mind the potential for coordination harms. And I can sort of imagine at least two sort of ways that having a standard could hurt things. First is it could be a methodological straitjacket. Okay, so if everyone is kind of de facto required to do the standard, if you don't do the standard, we're going to look at you with a microscope, and some referee might not like it, or whatever. So if you're forced to follow the standard, well, what if you came up with a better way? In your application, there's a better way than the standard. You might still go with the standard. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Okay, it also could be a damper on innovation. So if you know that even if you come up with a better way of validating antibodies, people won't adopt it because there already is a standard, well, then why bother? Okay, so that's another potential harm. Now the good news is, hopefully you're kind of already anticipating that we can avoid these. If we design the standards intentionally, we can avoid these problems. And first, by building in a conditional standard that helps deal with some of the problems with that, and a cumulative standard, one that builds on itself. How does that work? So we want to strike a balance with how much we encourage people to do the same thing and how much we allow them to do other things. Okay, so, but bearing in mind that the more fragmented practice is, the less of the kind of economies of scale and so on we get to enjoy. Okay? And as far as the damper on innovation part goes, imagine if we had a standard that had built into it a way to change the standard. Okay? And imagine that you're a scientist who comes up with a better way of validating an antibody for some application. You know now that the standard, once your great work is appreciated, we'll adopt it. And the whole research community will do what you just figured out. Okay, so building a standard that builds on itself can dramatically increase the incentives for people to invest in improving the methods. Okay. And moreover, the nice thing about an cumulative standard is it also can just build in the process of expanding the set of applications that we're talking about and the set of reagents that we're talking about over time. And so I have a little imaginary example here of a table of possible applications and different types of affinity reagents. And one thing that pops out once you put that up here is kind of an additional challenge, which is if we want to create a useful standard, say for a scientist who's doing a Western blotting application. Okay, so we've got monoclonal antibodies. There's a baseline standard that you don't want to ever go below, and that's denoted with a check mark. And then there's some sort of higher quality standard that's denoted by check plus. And then there's also recombinant options. Well, how are they supposed to decide what to do? Somehow we have to build in a means of comparison. Somehow the check pluses need to be comparable to each other. Even though they're very different reagents, okay, we need to have a way of comparing them meaningfully. Okay? And that not only helps the scientists choose what they want to use, but it does make it possible for us to identify when someone figures out when someone discovers a new reagent that's better than the current standard. Okay, so we can update our standard over time. And so if we're thinking about that, so how do we come up with a way to meaningfully compare? I think it's helpful to go to the experts. Okay, so these sites that help you compare things like gas grills, they've had decades of experience in how to help people compare extremely complex products with many attributes. Okay, so for instance, in this example, what do we got? We got 3 gas grills. And what does Consumer Reports do? Well, first of all, they provide a summary statistic. Okay, so there's this thing called the overall score. And so you can see that Gen Air is the best. I don't know if you can see. You probably can't see in the back. It's got a 78. Okay, and then the next one down is 77. The next one's 76. So this tells me that broadly speaking, they're almost the same, but there's a little bit difference. Now, the overall score, though, is kind of an arbitrary thing. Like, Consumer Reports has some formula they use. That formula actually isn't very important when you think about it, because as a consumer, I'm looking at all the characteristics. And the really interesting thing about the way Consumer Reports does it is it ranks all the characteristics. So if I'm a price-conscious shopper, I notice that the number 3 grill is $250 less than the number 1 grill. I'm going to have my own way of aggregating the information, and that guy's going to go to the top. Okay, on the other hand, maybe I just really need a side burner. Like all I care about is it has a side burner. Okay, I gotta get the Gen Air. Okay, so to make the analogy here, antibodies have many characteristics as well. Okay, and if we can come up with a standard way of ranking how antibodies fare on each of those dimensions in a way that can compare very different reagents, okay, then we can allow the scientists to figure out which is best for them. Okay? So I'm just going to give an example that I just made up. I'm sure you can come up with better ones, but the characteristic here is reproducibility. Okay, so and it doesn't really matter to put numbers on it, just as long as we can rank kind of the relative options. And I sort of so polyclonal might be the worst, monoclonal. And then maybe there's an option for a producer of a monoclonal antibody to kind of certify that they followed certain practices. Like to solve a problem of like lot variability or something like that. So that might be a higher rank. And notice that having this way of ranking quality would actually incentivize the producer perhaps to invest in that best practice certification when they wouldn't have otherwise. Okay? And then above that might be recombinant. And then, the gold standard might be recombinant with a sequence publicly available or permanently archived in some way. Okay, so if we could do that, if we could identify what are the key characteristics. So Consumer Reports, you can't quite read it, but how does it do under low temperature? How does it do under high temperature? They figured out that consumers care about that. I never would have thought to break that out as two. You, the scientists, can figure out what are the characteristics we need to be able to compare across reagents and then come up with a universal type of way of comparing them. And then you can let the scientists figure out for themselves which ones they want to use. All right. Anyway, so that's my stuff on. I totally forgot when I started, but whatever. So the databases stuff probably didn't have to get short script. Anyway, so I'm going to talk now a little bit about databases and some other things. And I'll just make a couple observations about databases, and let me just preface this by saying that I don't understand antibody databases yet. I have spent very little time thinking about them, so really all I'm doing is highlighting a couple potential dangers that my experience in other markets suggests you just want to be aware of, okay? So the first comment to make is that I think that validation standards could very well make these databases more valuable than they already are. Okay, that's really a good thing, because especially if they specialize in user-generated content. Okay, so you do a self-validation study, you post the results to some database. Now that database is more attractive for people to go to. All of a sudden, it has all the self-validation information. You can maybe see where I'm going here. It's a much more valuable database, but now it's a more powerful database. Okay, and with great power comes great responsibility. But anyway, so here are two imaginary situations. I'm not at all suggesting that, I won't even name the databases, which are the obvious analogies to these. But let's imagine that there's a dominant distributor. So this is a reseller. They don't make any antibody. But what they do is they get antibodies from producers and they sell them to people. But they start collecting these user-generated content. So they have all this wonderful data on the validity of these different antibodies, even better than the producer. Okay, so imagine. This is all hypothetical. Now, if that were to happen, this distributor would then have market power. It's a two-sided market power. They'd be squeezing the producer, they'd be squeezing the user. This is what we refer to as naked exercise of market power. Okay, so hopefully the DOJ will start getting involved here. Okay, so the second one, and that's an example with like an evil distributor intentionally doing this, right? But there's more subtle, unintentional dangers. So imagine you're a dominant antibody database. So you've got all the information in the world about these things, and you've become incredibly useful to people. So you've done a great job. You're the Google of antibodies, and everyone goes to you as their homepage. Okay? Now, once that has happened, it's very hard for other people to create a new database that could try to. It's very hard for someone to make a new search engine, even if it's better than Google, because everyone goes to Google. Okay? So in the same way, if there's one database that gets sufficiently valuable, it now becomes much harder. Even though the person running that database might want good stuff to happen, it just turns out to be, it's really hard to enter the market. And because there's no competition from other new databases, the leader doesn't have to do anything to keep its lead. So they might kind of go to sleep, okay, and stop delivering the new services that would otherwise have happened. Okay, so that's the second type of danger in market power. And interoperability can solve both of these problems. And I kind of talked about it before, so I'm going to skip that and just say a few words on these last three. So on the producers and certifying their processes, as well as certifying the quality of individual antibodies, we can think about that as, it's almost perfectly analogous to that Microsoft certification story I told. We have scientists instead of the company hiring. Okay? The scientist wants a valid antibody, but when we don't have a standard for validation and we don't have a certification process, like here's sort of I imagine the conversation they tell themselves, I'd like to use a valid antibody. It's hard to tell which one's valid. I guess I'll just look at the literature and see who's published what. Now, that's got to be as good as it can be for me, right? I'll just go with the literature. Okay? But the problem, of course, is that some published papers use invalid antibodies. It's like why we're here, right? So, wow, once we have the certification process, the scientists can now say, hey, I'll limit my search to certified validated antibodies. And once they do that, the producers have more incentive to validate and also to certify their validation. Okay? Now, having said that, I want to emphasize that this is a case where we have an empowering standard, so we actually don't necessarily want to mandate that people certify. Okay, so if we go to the logic of that, yeah, so do I have to talk? Yeah, so here's my kind of case against mandatory certification, and it's very similar to some arguments I made earlier. I mean, the purpose of a certification program is to allow firms to prove that they're doing something, and that's why you certify. And if you are a trusted player, you don't need to prove anything. In fact, if you're one of the very best in the market, you might be validating your antibodies at a higher, better standard than whatever has been specified as the certification standard. And we certainly wouldn't want to induce you or compel you to kind of drop to the lowest common denominator. Okay? So certification can be valuable, but mainly to allow the firms that don't have a good reputation to get a good reputation. And also to make it easier for new firms to enter the market. Okay. So that's all I have to say on that. Now, training standards. As I understand, there's a problem that many young scientists kind of don't know what they're doing. I don't know if there are there any young scientists here? I apologize. You know what you're doing because you're here. No, but anyway, you can think about you can think about why that might be. You might think about why that's happening. I mean, there's a natural game theory story for that. And we can think about the lab itself. The lab leader and the PhDs and postdocs are making choices, and they have to have a decision: do I want to publish more or train more? Think about it that way. And ultimately, everybody is sort of on the same page. I would assume that the goal here is to help your PhDs and postdocs live good lives, and they need to get good jobs. And how are they going to get good jobs? They got to do things that the market values. And what is the market value? Publication. Now, why does the market value publication? Because it's the only observable thing. If we create a certification program, now training can be made observable. And since no one wants to hire someone who doesn't know what they're doing, I can imagine employers would be like, yeah, I want to focus on people who are certified, trained. Okay? And once that happens, the PhDs and the lab leaders will create more time for them to do that. Okay, so this is an empowering standard because it improves the decisions. It gives PhDs opportunity to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. They'll choose to train more on their own, regardless of what their lab leader does. But it also changes their incentives as well. So they will do more training than they otherwise would do. And as well, the employers who are looking to hire people out of labs, they're going to be able to identify those who are better trained. Okay, so it has all these benefits, just like certification. All right, finally, and then I'll stop. Journal standards. So this is an interesting game, the game that journals play. And this is the first time I've shown a payoff matrix, because I have to kind of use this. This is the standard picture in game theory. The idea is you have one player chooses what row, and the other player chooses what column. And then the box that happens is the outcome. Okay? And I haven't put any numbers or payoffs in there. But anyway, we have a representative journal, say your journal. And then we have all the other journals who are all kind of clumped into that one column player. Imagine if no other journal, so first of all, imagine that somehow we come up with best practice standards. So it's unambiguous best practice, and it's a standard, okay? Now imagine we did that. But nonetheless, all the other journals chose not to require it. I mean, they said, we think you really should, but we're not going to require it. Okay? If you require it, what's going to happen? You're going to lose a lot of submissions. And now that's not a hypothetical. I think that the journals that have tried have lost some submissions, right? So it's in your own individual interest, if you're all of your peer group is not doing it, for you also to not do it. That's why the arrow points down there. That's capturing your incentive. All right? But what if everyone else requires it? What if you're the only journal not to require best practices be followed? Who's going to be submitting papers to your journal? Okay, you don't want those papers. We call those lemons. And that would be called the lemons problem. I don't know if you ever took a micro class, you would have learned that. So if everyone else is requiring, you actually want to require as well. Okay, so for that reason. So consequently, there are two equilibria here. One where everyone requires, one where no one requires. And we're starting kind of in the no require box, and we're trying to switch standards. Okay, so some coordinated behavior or some inducement for journals to change could be valuable to get there. But once we get to that spot, it's going to be very stable. We don't need to worry about constantly trying to force journals to continue requiring best practice. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to conclude now with this picture, which I think summarizes some of the key ideas. I have a new fan. All right, so what are some of the key points that came out? First of all, there are cases where we need to provide incentives, okay, to maintain the integrity of a standard. And there's many players who can help do that, including the community itself by creating customs. But journals and funders certainly are among the players who can play a key role in creating incentives. Okay? That said, we don't want to go crazy, because there are some contexts in which adding extra incentives can actually make things worse. Okay, so we need to be really careful in thinking which are the standards that are meant to improve decisions and which are the ones that are trying to solve a perverse incentive problem. Okay? So, all right, and then the next point is that we can avoid this sort of painful coordination in the standards trap by building into our standards a standard for changing the standard. Okay, so that's hopefully that makes sense what I just said. Okay, so make it a cumulative standard. They're both hard to say. Anyway, so that's another idea. And lastly, as we build out a standard, we need to think about how it'll be used. And I think one way, one important development could be, these things I call decision aids, and databases could be important in providing that service. And we need to just ensure that these decision aids are open and interoperable, and they're not used to accumulate market power. Okay, that's all I have.